a native English speaker say break down, break out, break into, or breakthrough, and suddenly wondered, wait, what does break mean here? You're not alone. These phrases can feel confusing because the same word can have completely different meanings depending on the situation. But once you understand how native speakers actually use them in real conversations, English becomes much easier and more natural. In today's lesson, we're going to break down these 4 powerful expressions, abirekta dobugren, bilut, birayentio, and biktr with simple, real-life examples you can start using in your own English conversations today. Stay with me, because by the end, these phrases will feel much more natural. Let's start with one of the most useful expressions in everyday English, break down. You may have heard this phrase many times, but the interesting thing is that it does not always mean the same thing. Native speakers use break down in several different situations, and the meaning changes depending on the context. That is why learning phrasal verbs by memorizing one definition is not enough. You need to understand how people actually use them in real conversations. The first common meaning of break down is when a machine, car, or piece of equipment stops working. For example, imagine you are driving to work and suddenly your car stops in the middle of the road. You might say, my car broke down. This simply means your car stopped working. You could also say, my computer broke down yesterday, meaning your computer stopped functioning properly. In everyday English, this is much more natural than saying, my car stopped functioning because of a mechanical problem. You will often hear breakdown when people talk about transportation. Someone might say, the bus broke down on the way to the city. Another person could say, my old phone keeps breaking down. In these examples, breakdown describes something that was working before but suddenly stopped working or developed a serious problem. But breakdown is not only used for machines. It can also describe a person who becomes extremely emotional and starts crying or loses control of their emotions. For example, imagine someone has been dealing with a lot of stress for several weeks. They have been trying to stay strong, but one day they cannot hold their emotions anymore. You might say, she broke down and started crying. Here, broke down has nothing to do with a machine. It means the person became overwhelmed emotionally. You might hear someone say, I was so stressed that I almost broke down. This is a very natural way to express emotional pressure. It can describe a moment when someone feels that everything has become too much. Another example is, after hearing the bad news, he broke down. This tells us that the news affected him deeply and he could no longer control his emotions. There is another important meaning of breakdown. And this one is especially useful when talking about information, problems, or complicated ideas. When you break something down, you explain it in smaller, simpler parts so that it becomes easier to understand. For example, if your English teacher explains a difficult grammar rule step by step, you can say, the teacher broke the grammar rule down for us. This means the teacher took something complicated and explained it in a simple way. You can also use it in everyday conversations. Imagine your friend is trying to understand a difficult business plan. You might say, let me break it down for you. This means, let me explain it simply. Then you might explain the idea one part at a time. This expression is extremely common in spoken English, especially when someone wants to make a complicated topic easier. For example, imagine someone asks you, how does this new system work? You could answer, okay, let me break it down. Then you explain the process in simple steps. This makes your English sound more natural because native speakers frequently use break it down when explaining something. Break down can also be used when talking about numbers or information. For example, a manager might say, let's break down the costs. This means they want to look at the costs separately instead of looking at one large total. Someone might say, can you break down the monthly expenses for me? They are asking you to separate the information into smaller categories so it becomes easier to understand. Another useful example is, the report breaks down the results by age group. Here, the information is divided into smaller sections. So when you hear breakdown, in this situation, think about the idea of taking something large or complicated and separating it into smaller, easier parts. Now let's look at the grammar because this will help you use the expression correctly. When talking about machines, you can say, my car broke down. You do not need an object after broke down. But when you mean explain something in smaller parts, you often use an object. For example, can you break this down for me? Here, this is the thing being explained. You can also change the tense depending on the situation. My car breaks down a lot describes something that happens regularly. My car broke down yesterday Describe something that happened in the past. My car has broken down twice this month, connects a past event to the present, and my car is breaking down, can suggest that the car is starting to have serious problems. The key is not to think of breakdown as having only one fixed meaning. Instead, listen to the words around it and understand the situation. If you are talking about a car, computer, machine, or bus, breakdown probably means it stopped working. If you are talking about a person and emotions, it may mean becoming overwhelmed or crying. If you are talking about information or an explanation, it usually means separating something complicated into simpler parts. Try to notice this phrase when you watch English movies, listen to podcasts, or have conversations with native speakers. When you hear someone say, "Let me break it down," pay attention to what happens next. Usually, the speaker is about to explain something in a simpler way. When someone says, "My car broke down," understand that they are talking about a mechanical problem. When someone says, "She broke down," look at the emotional context. Once you start recognizing these different meanings, breakdown becomes much less confusing. You stop translating the phrase word by word and start understanding it naturally from the situation. And that is one of the biggest steps toward thinking in English instead of constantly translating from your first language. So remember, a machine can break down, a person can break down emotionally, and a complicated idea can be broken down into simple parts. The phrase stays the same, but the meaning changes with the context. And learning to recognize that context is what helps you use break down naturally in real English conversations. Now let's focus on two expressions that can sound very similar but are actually used in different situations: break out and break into. Understanding the difference between them will help you sound much more natural in everyday English conversations. The good news is that once you understand the basic idea behind each expression, they become much easier to remember and use. Let's start with break out. One common meaning of break out is when something suddenly starts, especially something that people did not expect. For example, imagine you are sitting in a quiet room and suddenly someone starts laughing. You could say, "Everyone broke out laughing." Here, broke out laughing means that everyone suddenly started laughing. You can also say, "She broke out crying," which means she suddenly started crying. Another example is, the audience broke out cheering when the singer came onto the stage. The cheering started suddenly and strongly. You can use break out with different activities and situations. For example, a fight broke out outside the restaurant. This means a fight suddenly started. You might hear someone say, "A fire broke out in the building." This means a fire suddenly started. You could also say, "A storm broke out during the night." In these examples, break out gives the idea of something beginning suddenly, often without warning. Another important use of break out is when someone escapes from a place where they are being held. For example, the prisoner broke out of jail. This means the prisoner escaped from jail. You could also say, the prisoners tried to break out. Here the meaning is to escape. Notice the difference between break out laughing and break out of jail. In the first example, something suddenly begins. In the second example, someone escapes from a place. There is also a very common expression, break out of. We use this when someone leaves a situation, habit, or pattern that is difficult to escape from. For example, "I'm trying to break out of my comfort zone." This means you're trying to stop doing only what feels safe and familiar. You want to challenge yourself and try new things. You might also hear, "She broke out of her old routine and started exercising every morning." The idea is that she escaped from an old pattern and created a new one. Now let's move to break into. This expression has several useful meanings, and you will hear it often in real English conversations. One common meaning is entering a place by force, usually without permission. For example, "Someone broke into my car last night." This means someone entered the car illegally. You can also say, "Someone broke into our house while we were away." Here, break into means to enter a building or vehicle without permission, usually by forcing the door or window. But break into can also have a completely different meaning. It can mean suddenly starting to do something, especially laughing, crying, singing, or smiling. For example, "She broke into ladder." This means she suddenly started laughing. You could say, "He broke into a smile when he saw his family." He suddenly started smiling. Another natural example is, "The children broke into song." This means the children suddenly started singing. There is another important use of break into when talking about careers or industries. If someone breaks into an industry, it means they successfully enter that field, especially when it is difficult for beginners. For example, "She worked hard to break into the music industry." This means she managed to get opportunities in the music business. You could also say, it's difficult to break into the technology industry without experience. Here, break into means to enter a particular career or professional area. You may also hear break into the market. For example, the company is trying to break into the international market. This means the company is trying to enter and become successful in a new market. So, when you hear break into, think about entering something, whether that is a physical place, an activity, a career, or a market. Now let's compare the two expressions directly. Break out often focuses on something starting suddenly or someone escaping from something. Break into often focuses on entering something or suddenly beginning an action. For example, a fight broke out means the fight suddenly started. Someone broke into the building means someone entered the building illegally. She broke out laughing means she suddenly started laughing. She broke into laughter can also mean she suddenly started laughing. There are also situations where both expressions can appear in similar sentences, which is why English learners sometimes find them confusing. You might hear, he broke out laughing, and he broke into laughter. Both describe sudden laughter, but the structures are different. Break out is commonly followed by an activity such as laughing, crying, or cheering, while break into is often followed by a noun such as laughter, tears, or a smile. Let's practice some natural sentences. A fire broke out in the kitchen. The students broke out laughing. He broke out of prison. I need to break out of this boring routine. Someone broke into my apartment. She broke into tears after hearing the news. He broke into a big smile. She finally broke into the fashion industry. Each sentence gives you a different situation. But the meaning becomes clear when you focus on whether the idea is sudden beginning, escaping, or entering something. The best way to remember these expressions is not to memorize long dictionary definitions. Instead, connect each phrase with a simple picture in your mind. Imagine something suddenly starting, break out. Imagine someone entering a place, break into. Imagine someone escaping from a situation, break out of. Imagine someone entering a career or industry, break into. These simple mental connections can make the expressions much easier to remember and use naturally. Now let's talk about one of the most powerful expressions you can use in English. Breakthrough. This phrase is especially useful when you want to talk about success, progress, overcoming difficulties, or finally achieving something that seemed impossible before. When you hear someone say, I finally broke through, they usually mean that they overcame a difficult barrier or problem and reached a new level of success or understanding. It can be used in everyday conversations, personal development, work, learning, sports, business, and many other situations. For example, imagine that you have been learning English for a long time. You understand many words, you can read simple sentences, and you can follow English videos, but when it is time to speak, you feel nervous. You know what you want to say, but the words do not come out easily. Then, after practicing every day, something changes. Suddenly, you can speak more naturally. You stop translating every sentence in your head. You feel more confident. That moment can be described as a breakthrough. You can say, I finally broke through my fear of speaking English. Notice that breakthrough often gives us the feeling of moving through a barrier. Think about a wall in front of you. You keep trying to move forward, but something is stopping you. You continue working, practicing, and trying different methods. Then one day you get past that wall. You have broken through the barrier. In real life, the barrier may not be a physical wall. It could be fear, confusion, lack of confidence, a difficult problem, or a challenge that has been holding you back. Here is another example. Imagine someone who has been trying to get a better job for months. They apply to different companies, attend interviews, improve their skills, and sometimes receive rejection. It can feel frustrating, but eventually they get the opportunity they have been waiting for. They can say, after months of hard work, I finally broke through. The expression shows that they have overcome a difficult period and reached a better situation. You can also use breakthrough as a noun. This is very common. For example, I had a breakthrough in my English learning. This means you suddenly made an important improvement or understood something that you had struggled with before. You might say, yesterday, I had a breakthrough with pronunciation. Maybe you finally understood how to pronounce a difficult sound. Or you could say, I had a breakthrough when I realized that I didn't need to translate everything into my first language. There is an important difference between breakthrough and breakthrough. When you use breakthrough as a verb, you are talking about the action of overcoming a barrier. For example, she worked hard and broke through her limitations. When you use breakthrough as a noun, you are talking about the important success or discovery itself. For example, her new method was a major breakthrough. Let's bring this into a natural conversation. Imagine two friends talking. One friend says, "You seem much more confident in English these days." The other person could answer, "Yeah, I think I finally broke through. I used to be afraid of making mistakes, but now I just speak." That sounds natural because the person is describing a change after a long period of difficulty. You can use this expression for emotional challenges too. Someone might say, "I've been struggling with confidence, but I'm starting to break through." This means they are beginning to overcome their lack of confidence. You can also say, "I broke through his fear and finally gave the presentation." The idea is that fear was the barrier and he managed to move past it. And remember, a breakthrough does not always have to be huge. Sometimes it is a small moment that changes the way you understand something. Maybe you learn 5 new expressions and suddenly understand a conversation you could not understand before. Maybe you speak English for 10 minutes without stopping. Maybe you make a mistake in front of other people and realize that nothing terrible happened. These small moments can become breakthroughs because they help you move forward. So when you want to talk about overcoming a barrier and reaching a new level, remember, breakthrough. You can break through fear, confusion, difficulties, limitations, problems, and even habits that have been holding you back. And when that important moment finally happens, you can call it a breakthrough, especially when you feel that something has changed and you are no longer stuck where you were before.